Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the southern direction where we see the Russians have made another advancement here to the northwest of Verbove towards the Ukrainian fortifications in the area. We're seeing that the main fighting is currently taking way ahead of the Ukrainian fortifications in an attempt to reach the borders of these fortifications before they start storming them. We're seeing that the Ukrainian fortifications are right by the front line, and the Russians have gotten close to them in every aspect of the eastern parts of Robotyne, both in the northeastern parts, in the eastern parts, and to the southeastern parts. The fortifications are right next to the front line. The Russians have yet to storm any of these fortifications. They are so far only doing positional fighting ahead of them. This raises the question as to what sort of game the Russians are playing. Are they going to be storming them all at the same time? Why are they delaying one area before they move on to a new area? Is it to continuously have the Ukrainian forces on the move, to test the Ukrainian defenses? There's no real footage or reports indicating why or how this is taking place. We just know that the Russians are fighting within the central parts of Robotyne, with positional fighting taking place within the village, and the Russians are attempting to gain closer and closer to the fortifications here to the east of the Ukrainian positions. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of the west of Avdiivka, the Russians have managed to advance within the village of Tonenke to the northern parts of it. Fighting continues in the Dacia area and the northern parts of the village as the Russians are looking to gain full control over the area. This advancement was confirmed by this geolocation during the Russians advancing within the northern parts of the village, and with this the Russians are entering into the final stage of the Battle of Tonenke if they succeed. The Ukrainians are so far responding by launching counterattacks and sending additional reinforcements to stabilize the area and prevent the Russians from gaining control over the village. If the Russians manage to gain control over the village, they can relocate their forces towards Orlivka or Beredeshi, where they would look to capture both Beredeshi and Semenivka. It is reported by some Russian sources that the Russians have started crossing the river and fighting has reached Semenivka itself, whether that be from Orlivka or from Stepove, where the fighting has gone through Beredeshi. It is not clear, but we do know that heavy fighting is taking place in the area of Beredeshi to Semenivka, where the Ukrainians are launching counterattacks and the Russians are trying to storm these positions. We've seen a lot of footage coming from Berdeshi, with both the Russian and Ukrainian sides releasing footage from the area, and based on the footage we can see that the Russians regularly launch additional reinforcements and send infantry assault groups through the use of APCs to the front. As soon as the Russian infantry have positioned themselves within the village, they start assaulting and advancing through the village under the cover of Russian artillery and FPV drones, hitting the Ukrainian vehicles and counterattacks, trying to recapture the lost positions, while the Ukrainians mainly relying on their own FPV drones and the armored vehicles to constantly launch these counterattacks and try to recapture lost positions and prevent the Russian soldiers from advancing through. You also see a lot of usage of FPV drones on the Russian side on Ukrainian infantry within the area, and this is how we get back to the Battle of Nevelske, where the Russians have released footage of themselves within the village. So we get the first confirmed footage of Russian soldiers within the village of Nevelske. I have cut the video from a 5-minute long PR propaganda video down to different aspects so I can explain what happened in the fighting. First, we have some footage of shelling on Ukrainian positions within Nevelske. A Russian tank with a massive coke cage moving out of cover to get to a firing position where they cover fire for the Russian infantry entering the village. The infantry enters the village in 3 stages. First, they move through the already captured positions, getting closer to the front line in these small squads where they are staying far apart. Then during the night, they move closer and closer to the village, but then fighting to restart in the morning where they enter the village itself and then they raise their flag. If we assume that this is the general rule for how the Russians launch these operations, it becomes clearer exactly what sort of fighting we're seeing here to the west of Avdiivka. The Russians are sending troops during the day closer to the front line, where in the night they move to the next point, which is at the front line itself, and fighting begins in some night assaults, and they continue until morning, where they try to establish new positions. In this case, the Russians, where they were fighting here through Stepove, through Berdeshi, moving through the southern roads, they would be looking to get to the front line during the day and then get some positions through the night, moving closer or into Ukrainian positions throughout the village during the night before starting to establish the position and capture territory during the day, where they'll try to expand their zone of control. Depending on how many units, how much armored support, how much artillery support, and whether the Ukrainians counterattack or withdraw, we see the territory change according to that. We saw that the Russians reached the western parts of Berdeshi. It is, however, unlikely that the Russians have any foothold here within the western parts, and are likely just standing within the forest areas here to the central parts of the village. This is likely due to the Ukrainians with their counterattacks released footage by the 47th Mechanized Brigade showing Bradleys hitting some of these APCs and infantry concentrations of the Russians in the western parts. The Ukrainians launched a counterattack to push the Russians away and prevent them from establishing positions. It's likely that the Russians then withdrew to the forested areas to take cover, and through the cover of night either withdrew to the central parts of the village or eastern parts of the village, or they launched attacks in the western parts. Either way, they take these decisions of what to do next during the nighttime, where they move into position, and then in the daytime, that is when the main fighting takes place, especially here in the early morning. FPV drones have become a crucial part of the fighting taking place across the whole front line, and here we have one such example of how it has become a very widespread thing. We see in this video footage here Russian FPV drone operators in some area close to the front line, and a Ukrainian FPV drone flies by and through it as they miss these Russian soldiers, where we see how dangerous it is and how many FPV drones there simply are, and how vulnerable these FPV operators are if there's no air defense nearby. It's simply very difficult to hit these FPV drones while they're flying, and if there's a good FPV operator and they have detected a target, it is very likely that they'll just get hit. The situation across the front line is generally ever changing. Every day we see new developments, we see new fights taking place, and the situation constantly changes. But there's also long-term changes taking place. For example, this article here by The Telegraph: Ukraine faces ammunition crisis as air defense missiles dwindle. They claim that the Ukrainians will run out of air defense missiles by the end of March. Now we return to the old propaganda points of the very first months of the war, where the Russians would run out of missiles by the end of March. Now it's the Ukrainians running out of missiles by the end of March. I always take these reports with a grain of salt because none of these people actually know anything. They are just saying this to promote new aid to Ukraine, to keep them in the game. But there's also the possibility that this is actually true and this is actually accurate. There's just no evidence put forward for it. But based on these reports that we constantly get that the Ukrainians are running low on ammunition, yet at the same time we continuously get statements like this from Macron. Macron says again declining to rule out Western ground operations in Ukraine at some point. He mentions that he doesn't want to initiate it. I don't want it. I don't want to take the initiative. We will have to have operations on the ground, whatever they may be, to counter the Russian forces. So this is a direct statement towards French soldiers going to Ukraine to face off against Russian soldiers. He's previously mentioned Odessa as the point at which they will have some soldiers deployed there to face off against the Russians to prevent an advance there. There's this quote as well: France's strength is that we can do it. So he claims that if Ukraine fails, Ukraine still needs to win, so French soldiers simply just need to fill in the gaps in the Ukrainian army. And finally, why is French soldiers needed? Well, in this Washington Post article, in this Ukrainian village, almost no men are left. The mobilization has simply been crazy on the Ukrainian side. Since the very start of the war, they've constantly been mobilizing everyone, and at this rate, with the losses and whatever else decreases the amount of soldiers at the front line. The Ukrainians need additional soldiers, they want additional mobilizations, but in the villages there's simply no one left. If there's no Ukrainians to fight, Macron just wants the French to fight instead. And with that, I'll end off this video. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.